Today on The Future of Everything, the future of gels. A gel is a semi-solid, part liquid. The solid parts are usually chemically linked together to form a matrix of material that holds the fluid part and potentially other things. Gels are usually sufficiently stiff so they don't flow like a fluid. They just kind of sit there and wobble to some degree. Most of us get our introduction to gels at the dinner table. Jell-O, as in Jell-O molds, is a kind of gel. Also, for those who are more adventurous in their eating, aspic is kind of a gel made out of meat components. I'll leave it to you to explore that further. There are many other gels in everyday life. Part of our bodies are made out of gels. The inner part of the eyeball is a gel. Blood clots are gels. And parts of cartilage and tendons are gels. And of course, there's hair gel, which thickens hair and makes it more easily managed. Now, chemists and material scientists are very interested in developing new gels for new purposes. They can be used to deliver drugs, deliver vaccines, and package materials for sustained release over time, and many, many other applications. Of course, the trick is to get the gel to have the right physical properties for the task. Does it need to be biodegradable? How firm or wobbly should it be? What kind of chemicals might we want to embed in the gel so that they can be released? Will the gel be dissolved in water or other solvents? Will its breakdown products be toxic or biocompatible? And what is the range of temperatures that it needs to operate out? And many, many others. Professor Eric Appel is a professor of material science and engineering and of pediatrics at Stanford University. He's an expert on supramolecular biomaterials, which, as I understand it, includes gels. Eric, where did your passion for these materials come from?
I mean, in some ways, it's because of the opportunities that it poses, right? There's so many areas where there are great molecules, let's say great drugs, and they just simply don't get to where they need to be when they need to be there, or they're not around long enough. And one of the beautiful things about gels is that they can solve that problem. There's a really broad diversity of applications that people pursue with different kinds of polymeric materials and particularly hydrogels. And so there's really a lot of opportunity for creativity in this space.
So recently you you have worked in several areas, and we'll try to touch on as many of them as we can. But one kind of surprising thing that I think recently came out was some work on fire retardants. And many of us, especially in California, and especially in these days of climate change, and especially in the late summer, are very worried about fire. How did a material scientist get attracted, so to speak, to fire and the problems that it proposes to fire control, and where's the opportunity for gels?
Yeah, so this is maybe even another way to phrase that would be, how does somebody who spends most of their time developing drugs get into wildfire prevention? And I'd say I have a firm belief that most of most innovation occurs at interfaces, right? And so that requires that you go talk to people that you wouldn't normally talk to. And in this particular case, it was really born out of a conversation I was having with my brother-in-law, who happened to be the fire prevention forester for the state of Hawaii. And he was sort of lamenting how, there's this misconception that fires happen just at random in the forest, but, it turns out that's not really true.
Huh.
I mean, we know 95% of fires are started by people. And so it would make sense that most of those would be occurring in places where people frequent. And so if you know where the fires are starting, you might say, well, why can't we treat those areas with retardants, let's say, and stop them from starting in the first place, particularly the nuisance fires that are happening in, the wildland-urban interface where people live. And so if a fire were to get away, it would pose the greatest danger and this sort of thing. But in that initial conversation, my brother-in-law was talking about how, well, all of the retardants in current use are typically only used reactively, right? A fire starts, then they load up the tankers and they load up the planes and they roll out and they drop the iconic red stuff, right?
I was going to say, that's what we all think of, is a plane dropping red stuff and wondering what the heck is that? How does it work? So please Please go
Yeah.
on.
And so, those are retardant in a formulation, and formulation is just all the other stuff that gets it to drop properly and adhere to vegetation and stuff like that. But they weren't ever designed for local persistence, right? They were used, in the days right before a flaming front actually gets to something to either protect, towns or infrastructure or to divert fires away. And so, they weren't really applicable to any sort of preventative treatments to say like, oh, I know there's going to be fires here. Let's go spray it and try to protect it the whole season. And, for me, that was like a really light bulb moment because I thought to myself, wow, that sounds like a delivery problem, right?
Right.
You're not getting the retardant to where it needs to be for the duration of time that it matters, right?
So
And
let me
so,
ask, just for background, when you drop that red stuff, how long is it going to be an effective retardant, and what happens to it that makes it not a retardant anymore under the old way of doing things?
so all of those are called, they're called long-term retardants. And it's one of those things where you might say, well, how long is long, right? Because long-term retardants as a classification just mean that they still work when they dry, right? So if it's fire season, super hot, really humid, lots of high winds, you drop the things, the water evaporates immediately. And so what you have is a film of retardants on the vegetation. But that film will very easily wash away, right?
Okay.
So if there's a heavy dew, even this morning, it was around here, it was totally dewy. It was plenty dewy to wash away any of the existing retardants. But I'm
Gotcha.
sure by this afternoon, it's going to be smoking hot and it's going to be, perfect wildfire weather.
Gotcha.
And so that's why, I mean, it's really a delivery challenge. How do you get the retardants to stay on the vegetation where they matter? Because they don't work if they roll off into the soil.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So this is great. So you're at the forgive me, you're at the family barbecue, and you learn about this problem, and you say, okay, some of my skills might be relevant here. How did the project then proceed, and where are we?
Yeah, so I mean that's where, a lot of my biomedical research has focused on this same problem, right? Prolonged delivery. How can we encapsulate a active drug in a gel? Because really what's happening when you think of a gel, you can think of like a soccer net, right? And your drug as a soccer ball, and so it gets stuck in the net and it sticks around, where you want to keep it. And I figured this would be a perfect opportunity for a gel, but instead of encapsulating drugs, encapsulating standard fire retardants. Um, and so what we then did in my lab was go away and over the course of a year or so, began really tinkering with making gels that would be really easily synthesized, and cheap enough that you could actually make it at the scales, right? Because drugs are
I was going
relatively
to
small
say
scale and they're
the
really
volumes
expensive.
here are much bigger, aren't they? And one
Yeah.
dump is probably a whole year or two worth of some drugs, and you're doing that hundreds or thousands of times in the fire season.
Absolutely. So the scalability and cost was a really major, engineering requirement that we had to build in. And so we were able to develop a new material that used, simple and biodegradable components. There's cellulosic polymers that are often also used in food products just as viscosity modifiers. And so we could use these gels to encapsulate the retardants. And, we started small, on milligram scales using wood powder that we bought from Amazon, actually, just doing little burn studies and showing that, if we encapsulate the retardant in our gels, use that to treat the wood, even in the presence of, a simulated rain event, you get to maintain the retardancy on the vegetation. And then we moved up a scale, right? And we started working with kilograms of a couple different fuel types, both like actual grass and a shrubby kind of plant called chemise, which is a really big problem in California in particular, because it's a plant species that absolutely loves fire. And then after that work, then we moved up into like real field scale trials, and we were dealing with, treating 10 by 10 plots of grass out in a field.
Huh.
And we were treating a 100-kilo pile of chemise that had been, collected after a fuels treatment, right? So where they're like actually cutting down vegetation. And all of those larger scale field trials we got to do alongside some CAL FIRE personnel in the San Luis Obispo area. And so, each new stage it works, and then you sort of move it along. And really, it was at that stage when we saw it really working in a field, and we were there with firefighters, and they asked us, dang, this stuff works amazing. When can we buy it?
Wow.
And, we were like, well, I guess that means we need to start a company. So at that point, we launched a startup called Ladera Tech, and we licensed the technology from Stanford, and we started making larger amounts and pushing it along. About a year and a half after that, which was last May in 2020, Ladera Tech was acquired by Perimeter Solutions, which is the global leader in fire retardants.
Yep,
and they're the ones that produce all of the red stuff that you see. And so our fire prevention product is called Fortify. We tried to come up with a clever name that would, the millennials could verbize, right? Like, let's go fortify that hill. And then, and it was complementary to all of the other products that Perimeter Solutions had. And so it was a really great partnership. And, now it's out there in the real world. People can actually use it to protect their homes, protect other infrastructure.
Very satisfying. So let me ask, that sounds like an amazingly compressed time. I mean, you hear about good ideas getting to market, but you're often thinking about decades. But what was the barbecue to dropping red stuff? By the way, is the stuff still red, or did you change the color?
Oh, no. So the red stuff is the same. It's just dyed red so that the pilots can see where they've dropped it, right? So, our stuff is transparent. It doesn't need to dye.
Very cool. And what was the time from initiation of the idea to when you actually had a drop on a real fire?
So, again, we're not necessarily dropping the stuff on a fire. So
of course, forgive me, that was the whole idea. Yes.
Real world use in a prevention project, a large scale prevention project. I would say it was probably 2016 when we first did first had this conversation. That's actually when I joined Stanford. And then it would have been 2020 that we had, actually, no, late 2019 is when we had our first large scale treatment of a roadside to prevent roadside ignitions.
And now that you've redefined long, where long used to be until the next rainfall or dew, what's the new long?
Yeah, so the new long is, what we're really looking for is peak season duration, right? So we try to engineer the materials because, you don't want it to be too long. In some ways, it's too easy to make things that stick around in the environment forever, right? So we're targeting this kind of odd intermediate zone where you want to be able to treat in June or July and have protection against fires or ignition through December or January when we get the first, big 2 to 3 inches of rain, right? And then it's only with that level of rainfall that the materials wash off and then just degrade in the soil.
So that actually, this is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Eric Appel, and we're talking about gels and fire retardants. And that actually leads a little bit to what I wanted to ask, which is, you're a scientist, you're an engineer and a scientist. How much of this formulation of the gel was trial and error? And how much do we have like basic scientific and physical principles where you can actually make good guesses before ever doing the trial and error approach? Because you were talking about, I was getting a little bit of a Goldilocks feel that we don't want it to wash off after the first dew, but we don't want it to stay there forever. So there's very much this just right thing, which I imagine has some element of trial and error. But how is the theory? How much does theory and physics support and chemistry support these kinds of investigations?
Yeah, so there was a lot of both, I'd say. We had a decent idea or some intuition as to where we should start. And, if we want to get into the sciencey bit a little bit, what we had to engineer for was twofold. It was when it's a gel and it's actually in water, it has a bunch of stuff it has to do. It has to be able to be sprayed out of standard equipment. It needs to be easily synthesized. And we wanted the wet mechanical properties to be such that it adheres well to vegetation so
Right,
that more
right.
of what you actually stays
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
And it has the right kind of mechanical property so that it spreads on the vegetation and makes a really nice film, because these retardants really only work if they form nice films on the vegetation.
A bunch of droplets would be less useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Just fundamentally by how these particular kinds of retardants work. Um, but then, as you mentioned, the water evaporates quickly and then you have a dry film. And so you need the right mechanical properties of the dry film so that when you have a dew or you have a small rain event of a quarter or a half an inch of rain or something like that, the materials wouldn't wash away. And so that's a part where we didn't know,
Huh.
right? We didn't know exactly what was going to be needed. And so, we first made a library of materials, and then we evaluated how they behave when they were sprayed onto vegetation. So we were actually doing a lot of surface chemistry measurements and rheological measurements on the mechanical properties to show, or to try to tease apart, what actually makes for a material that will stick well and spread out and make a nice film on the vegetation. And then after that, we did other studies where it's like, okay, we now have dry films. Let's simulate rainfall and see which bits actually, what mechanical properties give rise to the durability that we were looking for.
I'm always very interested when there's a story about university discoveries making it out into the real world and industry. How does the industry respond to these innovations? Because at one time, I could imagine it's both a opportunity for them, but it also threatens a lot of their existing ways of doing things. So can you just paint a little picture about what is that interaction like when especially somebody like you who didn't really have a long history of fire retardant work, you were doing medical stuff, which we'll get to. How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it really depends on the industry, right, and who the people are. In this case, I think we benefited from the fact that we were really complementary to everything that had been going on, right? We weren't trying to just come into the exact same problem with a new product that was completely going to unseat, the existing big players. And this exists in a number of medical fields. There's an oligopoly or perhaps even a monopoly on certain areas, and going head to head with them is one challenge. But what we were really trying to do is to do something complementary, to say, okay, we also need reactive firefighting. That's never going to go away. But we can also, with new technology, change the paradigm a bit on, how we can, in the spring, while approaching fire season, prep better, right? Because we know that the season's going to be bad. So
right. And so that was not a hard case to make. It wasn't fundamentally as threatening as it could be. And so it got taken up. And then, of course, you started a company, and then there's an acquisition by a big, presumably capable and has the network to distribute. This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman, more with Professor Eric Appel on gels, delivery mechanisms, and related, next on Sirius XM. Welcome back to the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Eric Appel, and we're talking about gels and supra biomolecular ensembles of materials. Now, Eric, this story about the fire is great, but most of your work is actually in health and medical applications. And in 2021, no podcast would be complete without talking about COVID. And I know that you've done some work on basically improving COVID vaccines. How does that relate to fire retardants? Why are they the same problem in many ways in your head?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, because I really do see how the engineering requirements for both delivering the fire retardants and delivering vaccines are pretty similar. They're both sustained delivery problems, right? How do you get something to stick around longer? And we have a big program in vaccines, and prior to 2020, most of our work was looking at HIV or flu, and like most other vaccine researchers, we sort of switched gears, at least not entirely, but at least to start looking at new opportunities to develop better vaccines in this particular case. In some ways, there's a little bit of a difference, or we try to say the reason why sustained delivery matters for vaccines is that there's fundamentally a mismatch in the way vaccines are presented to our bodies and what our bodies have evolved to deal with, right? So, if you get sick with the flu even or COVID, you might have symptoms for a week or something like that, but your body is presented with the actual virus and pieces of the virus for weeks, right?
Right.
This is why you don't get antibodies until 2 weeks after your initial infection. But when you get injected with a regular aqueous solution of stuff, that just diffuses away and gets degraded and goes away. And so the little bits of the virus that are used to try to train your immune system to recognize it are only ever around for a couple days,
Right.
and this is why we need multiple shots. And so really the hypothesis that's underlying a lot of our work is if we could use a gel to prolong the exposure of the vaccine to our immune system, we could better recapitulate the sort of kinetics that our body is evolved to deal with, and then end up with more potent, more durable, higher quality immune responses that can help protect, particularly in the case of COVID or flu, against a broader array of variants.
So it's like a slow release vaccine where the slowness of the release is like releasing little virus pieces that more accurately emulates what would happen during a real infection. Does that actually work? Because to my knowledge, most vaccines that that we get all the time, flu, measles, mumps, rubella, those are the blast for just a couple of days. But as you point out, many of those do require boosters. And it's possible that with a slow release approach, either the boosters won't be required or they can be spread out farther. I'm saying this, but really it's a question. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's exactly right? Because, it's okay in places like the United States or Europe or other places to get people to go back to a healthcare center multiple times to get all of the shots that are required to develop complete immunity, to be fully vaccinated, as they say. But there's a lot of other parts of the world where that's really challenging, and so but even here, it's still burdensome to try to get people to go back 3 times for shots, and particularly with boosters that are needed annually. If you could extend that to once every 5 years, then that would be a really big deal.
So where is the work now? So you have me hooked on the idea. Is it just an idea, or do we have some progress in what I'll call, until you tell me not to, slow release COVID vaccine?
I think that's a perfect name for it. So, our initial work just focused on using a model vaccine. And, that was really the proof of concept, showing that if we could prolong the delivery of this vaccine over the course of, let's say, a month rather than just a few days, we get more antibodies, and the level of the antibodies persists for much, much, much longer. But more importantly than that, you get higher quality antibodies. So we showed in our initial work that you have antibodies that bind 1,000 times more strongly to the target than you would get if you just delivered a standard vaccine. And so our recent work has shown that we could take these same kinds of gels and use them to encapsulate even a standard COVID antigen that's not actually used in any of the vaccines, because in and of itself it's so poorly immunogenic that we can't use a vaccine or can't make a vaccine for it. But by prolonging its delivery, we get really potent and durable responses. And so we just had a paper accepted on this work that was showcasing these COVID vaccines. So if I rewind and just say, a lot of people have been hearing about the spike protein, right? This is what all of the mRNA vaccines are encoding for, right? They encode
it's the protein on the outside that actually makes it look like a little bit of a crown, which is why it's called coronavirus. It's the little spikies coming out of the. I'm just reminding everybody of this spike protein in case they haven't.
Yeah,
thought
exactly.
About it.
And so there's one little bit on the tip of the spike protein that's called the receptor binding domain. And that's the bit that actually binds to our cells and that actually mediates entry into our cells. Now, the spike protein as a whole is pretty immunogenic, right? It makes good vaccine responses, but it's also very poorly stable. And so from a manufacturing perspective, it's kind of hard to make, and it's also hard to ship it all over the world. But this receptor binding domain is really easy to make. It's 100 times easier to make than, or maybe even 500 times easier to make than the spike protein. And it's super duper stable. So, there's an opportunity to make vaccines that might not even need to be refrigerated, right? Which would really improve global access. But the unfortunate thing is that little RBD protein, just the little bit that actually does all the magic for the virus to get into our cells, is so poorly immunogenic that you can't make vaccine responses with traditional adjuvant systems.
That blast is just not enough to get this human immune system to recognize and build antibodies. But
exactly.
But a little bit more of a prolonged exposure does.
Yeah, and so we've shown that we can take this antigen, stick it in our gels with standard adjuvant systems that are available, in approved vaccines even, and with a shot of this, you can get robust neutralizing responses
so
that you just cannot get otherwise.
Super exciting, super important, especially with the emergence of variants like we've all heard about Delta. The ability to keep up with these antigens and have stronger immune responses is going to be critical. Well, so I have to ask, when we were talking about fire retardant, you talked about these two problems of delivering it when it's wet and having it spread over the leaves. I imagine that there's an analogous set, and I'm sure everybody's wondering, what do you mean you're going to put a gel in my arm? So I'm sure that you have to worry about like making sure that whatever this gel is, it can't be so viscous that it can't be injected. And are we talking about a big lumpy thing under my skin? Forgive me, but I think everybody's wondering, what will this be like to actually experience as a patient?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big things that we do, and why I'm in a material science department, is we think about some of these engineering requirements, right? How do you get a gel that's easily injected through standard needles, right? Because I hear this all the time, that thick things are hard to inject. And, I'm on a mission to say that is absolutely not true. Injectability is totally different from, being thick when you sort of look at it just, sitting under gravity. So we do a lot of work to define quantitatively what injectability means. And so that's really one of the key features of our gels, is that they could be loaded into a syringe, they can be easily injected with standard processes. The volume that you would administer is identical to what you would in any other system, right? And it just forms a little teeny blob. It's so small, I guarantee nobody would even notice that it's there. And it just slowly dissolves away. So you can imagine a little blob, and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller over the course of a month.
As it's giving the little pieces to the immune system.
Because it's just dissolving away. So it releases the vaccine as it's dissolving away.
Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.